Why Isn't Becky Twitchel Dead? A Tom and Scott Mystery, Book 2. Author Mark Richard Subro. Publisher St. Martin's Press, New York. Narrator Eric Ost. Chapter 6. I bent over the body and turned the head. It was Eric. I leaned closer, put my hand on his chest, felt it barely rise and fall. Strong as we are and as good a shape as we're in, it was still a struggle to carry Eric into the school. I called the paramedics and Mrs. Trask. We followed the ambulance to Palos Community Hospital. We met Mrs. Trask in the emergency room. We grabbed a bite to eat in the hospital cafeteria and went back to check on Eric. The doctor said the boy was in poor shape. He'd only been in the cold a few minutes, she thought, but the danger of frostbite was great. He might lose several fingers at least. They wouldn't know for a few days. He'd also been badly beaten and had 3 broken ribs. He was under sedation. We could see him in the next day. We talked to the police, listened to Mrs. Trask's complaints, and left. We went back to get my car. It was only 7, but the streets were nearly deserted. Scart's car glided easily over icy patches and through rapidly building drifts. When we'd found Eric, there hadn't been time for more than a perfunctory glance around. Back at school, we found any search was useless. I wanted to find Eric's gym bag. In the time since we found him, the snow had completely drifted over all traces of what had happened. We hunted in a wide arc out from the school, but couldn't find his bag. Scott followed as I drove my car to my place. Back at his car, I said, "Was this Becky's revenge? How could she know he told and what he told? Could she be that efficient? Found out so quick and had an attack carried out?" I shrugged. "We'll know more after we talk to Eric tomorrow. For now, I want to see the Conlins and Twitchels." While going through the files, I'd written down the home addresses and phone numbers of all the kids and adults involved. Mr. Conlin sat on the River's Edge school board. We drove to the Conlins. Paul answered the door with a confused look. He let us in. The Conlins lived in the exclusive area of River's Edge, newly built and filled with newly rich. Every home cost over $400,000. I explained that we wanted to talk to his parents. He shuffled nervously for a few moments, but his parents solved the problem of their availability by entering the room. I made introductions and explained that we wanted to talk to them. Mrs. Conlin looked refined, elegant, and brittle. Her hair, makeup, and outfit were as clean set and pressed as if she were ready for luncheon rather than for an evening at home. Mr. Conlin wore baggy old pants, a dumpy sweater, and a genial smile. His slippers flopped on the tile as he led us to a sitting room. Paul tried to follow, but his dad waved him away. He told him the adults needed to talk. Mrs. Conlin sat primly on the edge of a grimly brown settee. Mr. Conlin stood to her left and a little behind. All the furniture cluttered around may have been genuine antiques. As far as I knew, it could have been complete junk. Either way, I guess we were supposed to be aware of how expensive it was. None of it seemed to match. The Leroy Neiman sports scene hanging on the wall behind them contributed to the feeling that we were in a Better Homes and Gardens disaster area. Mrs. Conlin touched her blonde hairdo, rearranging nothing. She said, "I don't see why you're here. We've talked to the police quite enough. Paul has been sufficiently upset as it is. Just because the poor girl and that hideous boy were here before it happened is no reason to continue harassing us. Can't the children get together for a little innocent fun on a Sunday afternoon without all kinds of people making a horrible issue of it?" "I wouldn't call murder innocent fun," I said. The wispy wave of her hand dismissed my comment. Mr. Conlin stopped any retort of hers. He said, "Dear, perhaps you didn't catch Mr. Carpenter's name?" She patted her hair again. "Is that important, Harold, when we're talking about our son?" "Mr. Carpenter is a professional baseball player, dear. He's quite famous, a major sports star. I believe the papers have mentioned he owns a penthouse on Lakeshore Drive." "Really?" Her tone was more accommodating now. "Perhaps you could help Paul with his career. He's practiced very hard since he was 9. He studies too, of course. He's not a dummy. My father and brothers were athletes. She gave a little cough, meant to be demure, I guessed. I, of course, was a cheerleader. She gave a little twitter, then continued. We want him to follow in the family tradition, of course. He'll go to the best college and get an education. He'll need something to fall back on when his professional career is behind him. Perhaps Mr. Carpenter would endorse the opera benefit, her husband said. I'd be delighted, Scott said. You would? The titter returned, this time behind one of her hands. I'll just step into the study and get the information. She bustled out the door. Mr. Conlon's face split into a slow, easy grin. He was gray-haired and, I guessed, in his mid-50s. She'll be gone a few minutes, so we can get something accomplished. She means well. She gets Paul mixed up with her father, her brothers, and her ego. Don't get me wrong, I want Paul to succeed, but what he wants. I think this pressure is wrong. Mr. Conlon, I began. Call me Harry. Harry, I corrected. We want to find out more about Sunday, I explained. About Jeff and helping with the investigation. I can't tell you much. We had the monthly meeting with the sports boosters. Then we attended one of Sylvia's charity benefits. We got home quite late. News of the murder had already reached here before then. Did anyone chaperone the Sunday parties? My wife and I would stop in occasionally. The kids came here, because we have the largest TV screen. This last year, they added girls to the company. I guess sports can keep boys from discovering girls only for just so long. Did they do drugs or alcohol in the parties? I never saw any. I trust Paul implicitly. He's never betrayed my trust in him. Being kids in today's world, I suspect they did some experimenting. I know it's none of my business, but I'm curious about Paul's relationship with Becky Twitchel. He frowned. The girl is a problem. She always seems to have her hands all over him. Mrs. Conlon rolled in a portable bar. She'd heard her husband's last comment. You must be talking about that hideous Becky Twitchel, she said. After every visit from her, something is missing from this house. I know it's her who's stealing. I've warned Paul about her numerous times. She's nothing but trouble. You called Jeff hideous earlier, I said to her. Isn't a murderer hideous? She asked. He hasn't had a trial yet, I said. I got a nasty look for that crack. I hurried to ask, Did you know Susan Warren? She was not the right sort at all, I commented many times to my husband. Never in front of the poor girl, of course, that she dressed in rags. She wasn't even up to Kmart. She was hardly our concern, but that Becky girl was. Becky used to mouth off to my wife a great deal. I stayed out of the child's way. I told my wife any nasty comment she made would simply drive Paul and Becky together. My husband understands young people so much better than I. Her brittle smile hid any disagreement. We left a few moments later, refusing refreshment. Even though Mrs. Conlon pressed us, she beamed when we left. Though, Scott had agreed to attend an opera benefit in January. The things I do for you, he said in the car. I'm going to the opera. I hate the opera. They're going to be fat ladies with low-cut dresses bellowing to the last balcony. And opera queens who will swoon over you. Shit. Maybe you'll learn to like the opera. Maybe I'll flap my arms and fly to the moon. The snow had worsened, but the wind had let up a little. It was 8:30, early enough to stop in at the Twitchels'. As we drove, Scott said, I liked Mr. Conlon. He didn't seem rushed or driven, more laid back, cool. I reminded him that Mrs. Trask had said nasty things about Paul's parents. Speaking of nasty, aren't you afraid the Twitchels will cause problems at work? Mrs. Twitchel does seem to be behind the pressure there. When have you known me to put up with bullshit from work? Not often. And it's not starting tonight. My guess is lots of these people have something to hide. I want to find out what it is, and if it's connected to the murder. Or in the car radio, the announcer on WBBM, an all-news station, claimed it would stop snowing soon. They predicted 20 below by morning. Out the car window, it looked as if it would snow until the end of the next ice age. Scott's car purred through the storm. We were almost the only ones on the road. An angry Mr. Twitchel let us in. We explained why we'd come. He said, "Where's Becky? That tramp is out there somewhere in this chaos. She's never home. She's pulled this for the last time." They lived in the older section of River's Edge, north of the Forest Preserve. Dark wood paneling crept halfway up the walls. We talked in the foyer, coats on. He hadn't invited us in further. "You're overreacting, Fred." "Call." A woman's voice preceded a tall, striking-looking woman. She introduced herself to us. Mrs. Twitchel was a stark contrast to her short, freckled husband. She had to be in her 40s, but she tried for an early 20s look. She wore the worst-fitting clothes I'd ever seen. Her pants clean, tighter than a taut rubber band. If she had any taste, she'd have made it to the level of cheap whore. As it was, one needed an eye shield or preferably a blindfold to protect one's sensibilities from the clashing apple green and hot pink color scheme and mismatched styles. She pointed an elegantly painted maroon fingernail at me. "What are you doing here?" she said. She could have been her own snowstorm of cold. "Would you totally Becky alone?" "Don't cover for her again, Sally," he said. "You'll lose your temper again," she said. "You know what the doctor says about overexerting yourself." He didn't know I had a slut for a daughter. She turned to us. "It's time for your gentleman to leave." "We wanted to talk about Becky," I said. "She needs a strong hand, tough discipline to keep her in line. Sally's coddled her for years. That's the problem." Mrs. Twitchel added another 20 chilly degrees to her tone as she responded to him. "You can't see that she's a young woman. She needs to become independent." "Independent horseshit. She runs you. She'd like to run this house. Who pays the bills around here?" I tried a question. "Where's Becky tonight?" "Whoring with that Conlon boy," Mr. Twitchel said. "We just saw him at his house not more than a half hour ago," I said. "She was hiding there," he said. "He's lied for her before. He's got one thing on his mind." "You think that because it's all you have on your mind," Mrs. Twitchel said. I tried a different question. "Do you know anything about Becky's whereabouts Sunday?" "I think that's enough questions," Mrs. Twitchel said. "Our daughter, as should be abundantly clear to you, is none of your concern." This touched off another domestic barrage that looked ready to escalate into total war. We beat a hasty retreat. Scott let me drive I love the feel of the Porsche under my control. I suppose it's juvenile. I'm the only one who's had it up over 100 miles an hour. "That was a disaster," Scott said. As we neared the 167th Street on LaGrange Road, I noticed a car in the rearview mirror. I changed lanes, slowed down, put my turn signals on. The car followed relentlessly. I tapped Scott and pointed. "I think we're being followed," I said. "Again?" Scott sounded bored. I drove past our turnoff on 179th Street. The other car made no move over the I-80 bridge. As before, we passed a lumbering oil tanker just before the road narrowed to 2 lanes past 191st Street. The other car screeched around the tanker. In my rearview mirror, I watched the truck jackknife and skid to a stop 10 feet from the window of Fleckstein's Bakery. We caught the light on Orange and Willow Lane. The other car sped through on red. I gazed carefully at it in the rearview mirror. It didn't look like the car from the night before. "It's time to end this shit," I said. "What are you going to do?" "I think it's time to push this car a little. I recommend hanging on tight." At St. Francis Road, without slowing or signaling, I wrenched the car into a sharp left. Oncoming traffic screeched angrily. Our shadow followed us. St. Francis Road curves and winds. It has 2 exceptionally dangerous spots for speeding cars. The first is in front of the convent of the Franciscan Sisters of the Sacred Heart. I made the Porsche take this at 65. The tires held, but the curve is blind, and the oncoming car missed us by a foot at most. His horn blared until he realized there was someone right behind us. He settled slowly into the snowbank on the south side of the road. Our follower righted his swerving car and came on fast. I didn't think we did car chases, Scott said. What the hell? Why not? I replied. What if he starts shooting? Scott asked. Then I suspect this little car will go even faster. We gained on him as we flew toward the S-curve, just before 80th Street Avenue. The curve exists because of a farmhouse that sits on a 20-foot bluff. Motherfucker, Scott muttered. I glanced at him. His eyes were closed. His hands gripped the dashboard, braced for a crash. I glanced in the rearview mirror. We were still gaining. We hit the first leg of the curve, tires screaming. We jolted against the snowdrift on the left. The Porsche swung 360 degrees, paused, swayed. I gunned the engine. The car leapt through the second leg of the S, picking up speed as we drew away. Could we not do that again for a while? Scott said. We passed a car filled with kids heading toward the curve. I pointed. I'm more worried about them. 2 cars can barely take that curve as normal speed. If our tracker is there, it's going to be bloody, and we'll need to help the victims. I swung onto 80th Avenue, pulled into the farmhouse driveway, and snapped off the lights. No light shone in the house. I inched to the end of the driveway to look down at the S-curve. The kid-filled car sat half in the ditch, its driver out and shouting. Our follower backed and maneuvered to ease past him. I rolled my window down to catch anything that was said. I waited for the one car to maneuver past the other. In the headlight glare, it looked like a Trans Am. Another car entered the curve and paused. This driver asked the guy blocking the road whether he needed any help. The first driver said everybody was okay, and he called for a tow from his car phone. Let's get out while we can, Scott said. Nonsense. We're going to follow him. He frowned. I'm not sure I have the nerve for that kind of thing. We're about to find out, I said. It took precious seconds to turn around in the farmer's front yard. At the end of the driveway, I glanced around. No one going east on St. Francis Road. I was afraid we'd lost him. Then I saw red taillights top a rise going north on 80th Avenue. I jammed the car into gear and rushed off after our pursuer. Scott said, Let me check this to make sure I've got it absolutely clear. We are racing at, he eyed the speedometer, at 90 miles per hour after someone who may be trying to kill us. This is the coldest winter in 100 years. With the wind chilled, it's at least 70 below out. There are ice and snow patches everywhere on the roads, any one of which could hurtle us into oblivion. You worry too much. Besides, you've got your seatbelt on. That's a comfort. I want you to realize I'm just checking, not criticizing. However, if this gets us killed, I may raise 1 or 2 objections. We're closer, I whispered. I eased off the gas pedal. It's one guy, I think. I settled down to follow him. Why are we whispering? Scott whispered. I've never trailed someone who was trailing me. I've got goosebumps. Or rocks in your head. Maybe both. He turned left on 191st Street. I don't want any dramatic confrontations. I want to see where he goes. Maybe see who it is. He could spot us. He may have a gun. I'll stop if you want, seriously. The other guy turned right onto LaGrange Road. Scott grumbled. You're sticking this on my shoulders? This has to be by unanimous consent. It's deadly and dangerous. I vote yes. He sighed. You better watch the road. He's turning onto the interstate. The car ahead raced onto the ramp going west toward Joliet. We followed. He sped up to 75 and left it there to cruise. I dropped several cars behind, hiding behind a semi-truck or two. Enough cars broke the speed limit along with us to keep us hidden. I hoped, in one of winter's oddities, the road remained remarkably clear of snow. The wind howled straight out of the west. North-south roads might be difficult to drive, but for now, the highway was clear. Our pursuer didn't slow down through the 45-mile-per-hour speed zone in Joliet. Then again, nobody else ever does, either. Through Joliet and past the interchange with I-55, we sped into the night. Here, fewer cars offered us protection from discovery. I feared we were too far behind. We could easily miss him if he turned off, but on he went and on we followed. 50 minutes past I-55, he pulled off at the Ottawa exit. He sped south. The country roads slowed him. Even though the road had recently been plowed, drifts rapidly shifted back over it. We played cat and mouse through the sparse traffic into Grange Ridge, and then drove 5 more miles until he turned onto a private drive. I drove past, then doubled back. I paused a half-mile beyond the entrance. "Now what?" Scott asked. "We go exploring." I don't remember skulking about in the dark as being part of the agreement when we became lovers. "Shows what you know. It's right there after who has to take out the garbage on winter weekends." "Is not." I wumped his shoulder. It couldn't hurt through all that winter coat padding. "I'll show you when we get back. Until then, we've come this far. We might as well see the whole show." "I promise, if it looks even slightly dangerous, we'll go back. Get in the car and go home." He sighed. A bright half-moon and a star-filled sky above the wind-driven snow gave enough light to show the indecision in his rugged jaw. "Come on, big guy." He hesitated a little longer, then caught my eyes and held them. Finally, he nodded. I drove the car as far off the shoulder as I dared. To keep it hidden, I had confidence in its front-wheel drive to get us out of any deep drifts. Gravel crunched under our feet as we walked the 50 yards to the opening of the driveway. No cars passed us. A cloudless sky loomed above, but at ground level, the wind whipped snow at a violent pace. Rivulets of drift spread slowly across the road. Waves of white swept over our feet and disappeared down the road. A thin sheet of ice covered the gravel driveway, almost completely. Glassy ice from the last semi-thaw filled the potholes. From the road, we couldn't see the further end of the driveway, but we could make out lights in the distance. Barren black trees, branches, whipping in the wind, lined each side of the driveway. Even with the clear moonlight and starlight, we stumbled over ruts and bumps. "They could at least have paved the damn thing for us," Scott muttered. He was muffled from head to toe. I could barely see the slits where his eyes shone. At times the wind blew, the snow stinging into our eyes. By the time we got to the end of the driveway, my eyes had watered enough to form icicles on the scarf I had wrapped around my face. It took more than 15 minutes, a sudden turn bringing us to within 5 feet of the back of the Trans Am that had been following us. Painted flat black, it radiated a sinister warmth. I could hear the faint clicking of the cooling engine. Having nothing to write with, I repeated the license number in my head 5 or 6 times. We crouched behind the car and examined the vista in front of us. I lowered my scarf for a better view. Straight ahead, maybe 20 yards, stood a rumbling old farmhouse, 3 stories tall with numerous additions that had pushed the building far beyond its original shape. Lights shone in the house on the first floor. Only I couldn't see anyone moving inside. To our right, maybe 30 yards beyond the house, a haphazardly renovated old barn wheezed and groaned in the wind. A circular drive led past the house and around the barn. An unshoveled path led directly from the car to the house. Only one set of footprints disturbed the drifts toward the front door. To our left, the woods made a wide circle and then drew within 10 feet of the house. We inched in that direction. Our feet crunched frighteningly loudly in the darkness, but the noise of the wind would cover our passage, I hoped. We crept past the car. I glanced inside. The dark interior told me nothing. We inched along among the trees. Stealth in the Vietnam jungles was never like this, but the training then served me now. The woods provided enough cover for me to feel safe. I heard Scott's low breathing behind me. He moved less than 2 feet away. The wind pulled away, the sound of our feet crunching on the snow. Someone could have been following us at 5 feet, and I wouldn't have heard them. However, my jungle training, something I'd never lost. All those instincts I didn't want to remember came back. I was weary, alert, and I hoped a little dangerous. At the near point to the house, we stopped to reconnoiter. 2 feet from the house, barren bushes made an ice-covered picket fence. A light shone through the first floor window, closest to the front. I put my lips next to where Scott's ear most likely was, inside his blue knit cap. "I want a good, clear look," I said. "Stay here." I left before he could object. I rushed across the expanse of covering darkness and stopped an inch from the house, almost slipping on the ice that pulled close to the foundation bricks. I tiptoed closer to the window. Slowly I raised my head, every sense alert to any possible movement. At the moment, the wind presented the largest problem. It whipped around this side of the house in a gale. Again, my eyes stung with the wind-driven snow. I feared that the constant watering might prevent me from seeing. I crouched over with one hand. I gripped the windowsill. I placed my other hand against the house, felt it slip, caught myself. I planted my feet as carefully as possible. I raised my head, millimeter by millimeter, toward the windowsill. My left eye appeared over the rim of the sill a minute before the other. I saw a wall covered with bookcases directly opposite me. In front of it sat a massive desk, the large wooden type they made for school teachers before they discovered cheap plastic or steel ones. I turned my head left an inch. I glimpsed a barren wall with a doorway in the middle, leading to the darkened room beyond. I switched back to the right with painful slowness. Holding such a tight position began to strain my muscles. I'd have to leave in a few minutes. To the right I saw Pete Montini standing on one side of a fireplace, head down, fist clenched. On the other side of the fireplace was a man I didn't recognize. He towered to at least 6'9". He wore baggy painter pants. A red checked flannel shirt opened at the throat to reveal a long-sleeved winter t-shirt, the ends of which shone at his wrists. He shook his extended hand, finger pointing an inch from Pete's face. I couldn't hear their words. Between them, on a rug in front of the fireplace, lay a German shepherd puppy. His head lay on his paws, his eyes flicking to the two humans above. I hoped his well-trained mother or father wasn't around. Pete raised a hand as if pleading. The other slammed his fist on the mantelpiece. Pete flushed red. He shook his head, no, over and over. He seemed to be welting under the bullying of the other. The stranger raised a hand to slap Pete. At that moment, my straining muscles began to give way. I caught myself with my left hand on the windowsill. An eternity later, I breathed. I looked again. Pete held the side of his face. The dog's head was up, ears at attention, eyes staring to the window where I perched. Time to leave. Young or not, trained or not, I didn't want to wrestle with a German shepherd and his overly large master. I turned to steal away. My foot slipped. I caught myself for an instant, felt myself falling, grabbed a bush. It held, but my feet began to slide sideways. An instant later, my left leg gave a solid thump against the wall. Immediately, the dog roared to life. For a puppy, he sounded like a regiment. I dashed for the cover of the trees. Halfway across the glaring openness, floodlights bathed the entire perimeter of the house, as bright as daylight. I heard dogs slamming, loud shouting. In the shelter of the trees, I searched frantically for Scott. I heard a shotgun blast, felt the pellets whiz past my head. I ducked down. "Scott!" I whispered, stumbling and sliding. I hurried toward the Trans Am and the beginning of the driveway. I didn't want to chance a direct dash through the woods and possibly risk getting lost with a dog on my trail, followed by at least one man with a shotgun. Where was Scott? Then I heard a hoarse whisper behind me. I recognized Scott's muffled yelps. I stopped. Making no attempt to be quiet, he stumbled into the tree that I was hiding behind. The lights from the house let us see far enough into the woods to make our way along the perimeter. Scott said, "What the hell?" The shotgun boomed. "Later, run!" Forgetting quiet or attempts at concealment, we raced for the driveway, then rushed back the way we had come. The ice on the drive proved nastily treacherous. Because of our haste, twice I slipped. Once Scott fell in a heap. I dragged him up, and we kept going. I heard the car behind us roar to life. "Through here!" I shouted to Scott. No choice now, and by hurrying across country, we could cut closer to the car. We stumbled, fell, struggled on. The snow dragged at our feet, making it harder than running in sand. Branches whipped our faces as we dashed past threatening trees. We hit the road. The black Trans Am sat at the end of the driveway. If he decided to go left, we could make a dash to our car. We had a 50% chance. Scott scrambled on the ground. He heaved a large slab of ice to his waist. The slab was larger than a grapefruit and had jagged edges. He hefted it carefully, then wound up and pitched it far over the waiting car. It thumped with satisfying loudness through a mass of pine branches, at least 50 feet to the other side of the car. After a moment's hesitation, the Trans Am took off in that direction. We watched the taillights for a moment, then ran to our car and threw ourselves in. I jammed the keys into the ignition. It roared to life. The tires squealed in protest, spun on the ice, almost sank into the snow. I swore. I eased up on the gas pedal for a second, let the tires catch, then swung an arc to U-turn away from pursuit. As we circled, I saw the taillights on the other car glow bright as it braked. It began its turn. I righted the Porsche and floored it for a few minutes. The diminishing lights of the following car pursued us, but I had the Porsche flat out. Fortunately, no one else had chosen this night for a pleasant excursion. Countless times we plowed through growing drifts, and I thought I might lose control of the car, but the tires caught the road each time, and the car purred on beautifully. At the first crossroad, I turned north. We hit Route 178 near Royan. We roared back north through the sleeping town 2 miles beyond. We hit Interstate 80 for the first time. I slowed to something approaching the speed limit. I unhunched my shoulders and looked at Scott. "Let's do that again. Say sometime when we're in our 90s? He drew a deep breath. "What did you see?" I filled him in. Scott said, "We should tell the cops." "What?" I said. "That we trespassed?" "The guy followed us, and we followed him. We don't have a case." He grumbled a while. I told him that whenever we next saw Frank, I'd mention it, but I doubted they could do anything based on what had happened. He'd tried to memorize the Trans Am's license number 2. With all the excitement and even pooling our memories, we couldn't remember any of it. We drove the last half hour in silence. By the time we got to New Lenox, Scott's head rested on the window. As he slept, I kept myself awake, with thoughts of what all of it meant. I didn't feel we were close to clearing Jeff or finding out who killed Susan. Montoni and Wyndham were hip deep in some kind of shit. With the mystery man I'd seen tonight, I presumed what and how I wasn't sure, but drugs were a good bet. At home, we quickly undressed and crawled into bed. I snuggled close to Scott, draping an arm around him as he lay. On his side, my chest against his back, he yawned. I caught it and did the same. "Thanks for sticking with me," I said. "No problem," he muttered. "One of us has to keep sane in this relationship." I rubbed my 5 o'clock shadow gently around the back of his neck. "Shit," he said. "I thought you liked this," I mumbled into his neck. "I do. I forgot your mom called today with last-minute changes in Christmas plans. Nigh on to perfection he may be, but besides nagging about cars, he forgets messages. I was too tired to go over that argument. We discussed familial logistics for a few minutes. "No word from your folks?" I asked. "No. They'll come around," I assured him. The Judy Collins tape I'd placed on the stereo clicked off. We listened to the wind once again, raised to a gale-like howl. As we pulled up to the house, I couldn't believe how high the drifts were. 3 feet in some places, and this with only blowing snow from the last storm. Drowsiness and comfort crept over me. The phone rang. "What the fuck?" I glanced at the clock. "It's 1 in the morning," I moaned. I plodded to the living room to pick up the phone. I put off getting an extension for the bedroom for 10 years. As I answered the jangling thing, I could see Wolf Road out the picture window. Not a car moved on it. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.